state budget that's going to require residents to show that they're lawfully present in order to get a driver's license. Clearly, we know what your position is in terms of compliance with real ID. But I'd like to know, in your words, how you would respond to those members of the community that we've seen on social media and just within the community discussing their somewhat anger or feeling of being targeted by this change in policy. That may be their perception. I'd like to know what your response to them would be so that they could get a better sense of where you're coming from.
Well, I guess what I would say is that I respect people's concerns about this, which is why we spent so much time talking to local officials who've been dealing with the federal policy for over a year and live and operate in communities with significant immigrant populations before we decided to put this in place. The second thing I would say is we waited for a year before we did anything to see what the reality on the ground would be with the new federal policy. And a big part of our conversations with folks at the local level were about how the federal policy was different from the old one, if in fact it had changed in a fairly significant way the role of the federal government and how they were relating to folks at the local level. And we got a lot of very positive affirmation about the federal changes. And if you look at a lot of the communities we've talked to about this, they were pretty supportive of what we were proposing to do. And my final point would be, we are going to keep statistics on this, and we're going to keep them pretty regularly. And if it turns out that, as I said, this thing is entrapping people who shouldn't be entrapped, then we'll reconsider it.
Yes, Governor, part of the anxiety, especially in the black community, which includes immigrants from Africa, Haiti, Caribbean, Brazil, and other countries, if a trooper asks someone about their immigration status and they were not supposed to ask them, and there's an investigation, like what Secretary is saying, most people don't believe that it's going to be fair towards them based on the current situation in this country about the African and the black community. Secondly, what I hear most people saying is they're not sure from your office, they didn't hear whether this law will include renewing of licenses. If a license expires, if someone visits a registry of motor vehicle to try to renew their license, are they going to be asked about their immigration status?
Well, if they have lawful presence, which was the term that, by the way, we got from the folks at MIRA when we were talking about this, if they have lawful presence in the Commonwealth, then their license will get renewed. But if they have a student visa, and that student visa lasts for 2 years, the license they'll get will last for 2 years, and if they come in and try and renew the license when they're no longer operating under the terms of that visa, they won't get renewed then because they don't have, quote, lawful presence. But that word, lawful presence, is a word of art, and it defines under federal law a whole bunch of categories that represent not just citizens, but people who are in the United States lawfully. And it includes folks like Haitian refugees, people who are victims of trafficking, a whole bunch of other categories as well. And we adopted that term as part of our conversation with the legislature and the advocacy community, and it was MIRA that actually said to us lawful presence is the proper terminology for determining someone who is, quote, in the country legally, for a whole bunch of reasons that are established under federal law.
And there are people who had visas that expired and they're still around, and they're wondering whether they're going to be included in that term of lawful presence.
No, they'll have to get their visa renewed.
So that's part of
That's the point.
Yeah, people want to know that exactly, because some people, there's also a fear that some people are saying, okay, if this is going to happen in Massachusetts, people are planning, some of them are planning to move out to other states that are seen as friendly to people like who fall into that category.
Well, I would argue that Massachusetts is a general rule. I mean, nobody's perfect, but I would argue that on most standards and in most ways relative to other states, we're as good as or better than most when it comes to be a welcoming community. And I put our policies up against anybody on that. But the standard that the legislature and we agreed to was a lawful presence standard for driver's licenses. And that was something that was again based on a terminology that we got from our conversations with the advocacy community.
Exactly, criminals out there. And then there's another thing, if it's my uncle is a criminal, am I gonna call the police? And the police gonna come over here and gonna get my father, my mom, and everybody else? No, I'm not gonna call the police. So that's why I feel the community might not work in our favor by having a process. Because it's not clear now for the majority of the community, and then the whole immigrant community just got afraid and lose complete connection to the police, which would then work very hard to do.
I think that's that's one of the most significant concerns that we had about this policy too, which is why I made Dan talk to so many different folks in local law enforcement before we implemented the policy. We also waited for a year. I mean, President Obama, to his credit, took what was the original structure around secure communities and dramatically narrowed what was covered under it. It took a whole bunch of stuff because of issues and concerns people had about exactly the kind of story you just told off the table, and said, going forward, it's really only going to be about people who are murderers, terrorists. I can't remember the other categories, but there was like literally just 4 or 5 categories, and they all involve major crimes. And the reason he did that was for the right reason, because the net was too broad, and they were pulling people into the net who didn't belong in it. And we waited to see how that actually worked for a year. And we talked to a bunch of folks in local law enforcement about how it worked in their communities, especially those who had communities that we would all agree, I think, are heavily populated by immigrant populations. And we got a lot of pretty favorable response. And the other thing I would say is, when you listen to what a bunch of these communities actually do now, and you read their policies, they're virtually the same as the one we're doing. And I said to Dan, I want you to keep track of this, and if it turns out that people are using the policy, or people are using it in a way that is not serving the intended purpose, which is literally a very narrow list of people who have demonstrated pretty significant danger to the Commonwealth and to the country, then we're going to revisit it, because that's not what the intent is here. And I completely understand your concern, given the experience people had previously under the original federal program. But to the president's credit, I mean, he really dramatically scaled back who they were focusing on, sent out really clear instructions to local communities about that. We spent a bunch of time with a bunch of those communities to make sure that what we were doing was pretty consistent, and what we were proposing to do was pretty consistent with what they did. And we're going to keep stats. And if we get together and we have issues with respect to the stats, we'll reconsider the policy.
Governor, Secretary, Patricia with Brazilian Magazine. So you said that this is not intended to detain somebody for just speeding or not driving without a license, and that you'll take violations very seriously. What is the process for somebody who might be stopped by a state trooper and ask questions about their status and feel like they've been harassed? They're not taken in, but they still feel like they've been targeted because they're a minority, or feel like they've been harassed. Because we all know people who've been stopped and just been hounded with questions, and then they take the license. Oh, sorry. I've been in the car in situations like that. So what would the process be for reporting that? Because people are afraid.
I think that there is, that you report it right to state police headquarters, and we do an investigation into that. And it should be an investigation into that trooper, and make a decision whether or not that trooper is being appropriate. I under the circumstances. And it'd be an unbiased investigation by the state police. I can't promise, and I don't promise that every time it's gonna have the results that the people in that car are looking for. But it's clear under the law that there is no reason to be asking a person other than the driver, and it's only under very specific circumstances. I'm not going to get into every legal reason why you would be asking a person whether or not, and it does have to do with the amount of time that they've had a driver's license and things like that, why you would be asking a person whether they're citizens of the United States or how long they've been in the state. But it would be a very specific, narrow time and issue why I would be asking them. They certainly shouldn't be doing it in harassing. It would have to do with an investigation. And they never, ever should be asking anybody else in the car. There's no reason to be doing that.
You know, the other thing I would say is, if people were concerned about calling the state police, because it's the state police, and I kind of understand that, they can call constituent services, okay? And, I mean, you guys, I don't know if you get those kinds of calls or not, but what I will tell you is constituent services takes that kind of stuff very seriously, and on many issues serves as the inquiry for people who are concerned about stuff that's happened. And they do it on a lot of different stuff, and they can do it in a way that retains, in some cases, I mean, it depends about how far into it you get, but they can certainly retain somebody's anonymity for some period of time if that's important. Depending upon the nature of the allegation and the issue that somebody raises, it may be at some point that they're going to have to tell us who they are and what time the thing happened and all the rest, because that'll ultimately be important for purposes of the follow-through. But
following a little bit on the topic of the community leaders and people who are not so happy about these new laws, have you, or maybe you plan or have you done already meetings with them? And because we all learned something new today, I bet, of all what you're talking. Are you making meetings with them? Are you planning to do some informational campaign so people are aware of what it is and what is not, and they can take more informed decisions on how to react about what is happening?
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think just real quick,
But
with
wait.
the activists who are talking to them face to face, so they don't read the El Mundo story, they didn't see the Univision, they're getting a different message. So I think what Rafael was talking about, or at least I was, is talking to these activists who have these immigrant groups, you know, and explaining it to them as well. So I'm glad you're doing it with us, but if you do something with them, we're gonna show up as well.
Yeah, so I was gonna get to that, I was gonna wait till
Yeah.
it was my turn, but essentially, we are doing that in our community conversations. From, at our last meeting, it was the same kind of similar issue was addressed about how do you get information and how do we deliver information to the community. So what we're doing now is we call it community conversations, and we're trying to go to every gateway city in the Commonwealth, and we're trying to let the community know what we're doing. But bigger than that, we want to hear what's going on in your community. So issues like this, and a host of other issues like youth violence, youth jobs, and the list goes on. We're able to go to different cities and kind of hear some of the concerns. We started in April. Our first meeting was in Lowell, and we've kind of been working our way out to Western Mass, and we're going to work our way back in. We've done 8 so far, and we have 4 upcoming. These meetings are close to the press because we want to, hear from community members and nonprofit heads and people who are kind of directly responsible for constituents or certain communities. So we feel it's been successful the way we are delivering information, and we're also learning a great deal as well, as far as what we can put on our website, things that we can do to kind of communicate better. But so far we've had great dialogue with.
Where you been, Darren? Tell me about.
So we started in Lowell in April. That was our first meeting. From Lowell we did Lawrence, Fall River, New Bedford, Lawrence, Lynn, Springfield, Worcester, and we have Brockton. Oh, we did Brockton, and then we have Taunton coming up, and Weedmore after Taunton. So total list is 18.
I wanna be as transparent as we possibly can about the practical implication of this, okay? And we will do what we need to do to make sure you guys are in a position